Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give folks about a minute or so to join us, and then we will get going on our Public Viewpoints webinar. Welcome. For those of you who just joined us, we're just going to give everyone 30 seconds or so to join in, and then we will get going. All right. Well, welcome. I'm Jenna Talbot, a Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I have the pleasure of working alongside the Strata Center for Consumer Insights. And today we're going to be discussing Public Viewpoints, which is Strata's ongoing nationally representative survey that was launched at the outset of the pandemic to really understand the impact of COVID on Americans' work and education. And this week, at this point, we've now surveyed almost 11,000 Americans. There's lots of rich data here to dig into. This week, we're going to be looking specifically at career decisions and what are Americans' perspectives on transitions, potential transitions, and really the role that education and training might play in making those transitions. As always, we'll have a great discussion with the data and then move quickly into a conversation with our panelists today. And then certainly want to open it up to as many questions and answers, as many questions from the audience as possible. We've loved the engagement over the last 10 weeks from folks in the audience. So please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box, include your name and your affiliation. We've had just a really robust community and always love to know who's joining us. But before we get started, we'll hand it over to Andrew, but I'll just give you a preview of the folks that are joining us today to make sense of this new data. We have Karan Chopra, who's co-founder and senior advisor at Opportunity at Work. We have Brent Orrell, who is the resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Carol D'Amico, executive vice president for learning and policy at Strata Education Network. So we will get into the conversation pretty quickly here. But first, Andrew, we'll pass it over to you to walk us through this week's data.
Well, thank you, Jenna. And on behalf of Strata, thank you to everyone who is joining us today. The COVID-19 crisis has left millions of Americans without work. The job gains of the past 2 decades were erased within the span of a month. We are now officially in a recession, though there's a great deal of uncertainty about how deep and long that recession will be. We also don't know what the shape of the recovery will look like. Will it be a U-shaped recovery with a slow return to full employment, or a V-shaped recovery that's more rapid? A couple of weeks ago, the Federal Reserve projected a long recovery with elevated employment through at least 2022. And when the economy's down, the best, according to many economists, is this: go build. And so as workers are struggling to adapt, we think millions of them are going to be looking to reskill and change jobs and careers. That was our motivation for launching the Strata Public Viewpoint more than 2 months ago, which is to get real-time signals about how the COVID-19 crisis was having an impact on work and education. So each week for the past 11 weeks, we've been surveying a nationally representative sample of 1,000 Americans over the age of 18 to better understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on work, as well as capturing their perspectives and plans on education and training. We now have more than 11,000 survey respondents in our database. We've been releasing the results of the Public Viewpoints on a weekly basis for the most part. Over the past 2 months, we've analyzed a handful of topics, including how COVID-19 has disrupted work, how it's disrupted Americans' education plans, and as well as the disproportionate impact that the crisis has had on communities of color, on the leisure and hospitality sector, and on millennials, for example. So one question that we've been asking is whether adults are likely to enroll in an education or training program across time horizons, ranging from anywhere from 1 month to 5 years. And we found that there is a robust interest in post-secondary education in the midst of this crisis, as you might suspect. So 25% of working age adults say they're very or extremely likely to enroll in some kind of education or training program in the next 6 months. As you'd expect, it's higher for certain age groups. 18 to 24-year-olds, 37% say they're very or extremely likely to enroll. And there's also especially keen interest in online programs and work-based learning programs, as well as community colleges and trade schools, broadly speaking. So this week, what we took a deeper dive into workers who indicated that they were interested in changing fields with these 4 research questions in mind. Number 1, who's most interested in changing fields? 2, which fields are these workers most looking to move into? What is motivating them to make a change? And then finally, what are their perspectives with respect to education and training? So a little housekeeping before we get into the analysis. First, our analysis is based on compiled data from all weeks that we've been conducting the survey. The population we're analyzing is adults 18 and older living in the United States. Though some questions were asked only of working age adults, or we restricted to working age adults, and others were only asked of adults in the workforce. All of that information is footnoted and will be on there available when we post the slides. We break workers into 12 different job fields, including education, healthcare, retail, leisure and hospitality, IT, manufacturing, construction, and a few others. Just a few notes on those categories. They are self-reported. Survey respondents were presented with a number of categories and selected the field that most closely matched where they worked. A few of the fields are aggregated from what the categories that our survey respondents were shown. Leisure and hospitality includes things like restaurants and food service, hotel workers, travel, workers in the travel industry, and so on. Personal care and services includes things like childcare workers, cosmetologists, skincare professionals, and housekeepers. And then finally, business includes management, as well as many back office functions like HR, communications, and the like. And it also includes consulting and sales. I think the other categories are pretty straightforward, but please post any questions that you have to the Q&A, and my colleagues should be able to answer those. So with that housekeeping out of the way, let's dig into the results. So we first investigated how many workers or who was sort of looking to change fields. And we found broadly that 1 in 3 workers said that they would change their field if they lost their jobs. And that didn't vary much across educational attainment levels. Those with bachelor's degrees or more were slightly more likely to say they would change fields. It did vary a bit across job fields. So in prior analyses, we've reported that interest in changing fields is consistently higher for workers in IT, finance, and manufacturing, who are the most likely to say that they're interested in potentially changing fields, while business, education, and healthcare workers have expressed the least interest in leaving. This week, we looked at where these workers are looking to go. And so we found first that the greatest interest was in transitioning into business, IT, and finance, while workers were least interested in transitioning into manufacturing, personal care and services, and retail. And I think it's also noteworthy to point out that in healthcare, there's a relatively low interest here. So we then wanted to know, are there jobs in the fields that these workers are looking to go? So we pulled job openings data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their job openings and labor turnover survey, or JOLTS, and a few things stand out from this data. Number one, for the folks who are looking to move into business or IT, there are a lot of job openings. But the second piece that we noted was that there are 3 fields specifically healthcare, retail, and manufacturing, in which there are a lot of job openings, nearly 1 million in healthcare, 500,000 in retail, 300,000 in manufacturing, but workers' interest in moving into these fields is relatively low. So the big question I think that this raises for these sectors is, how are they going to develop and attract talent? I mean, even before the crisis, the healthcare industry has had to immigrate talent to a large extent to fill job openings. And now the risks associated with those jobs have become even greater. I should also say that a big caveat on this data is that, this is what the job market looked like in April, a couple months ago. And so question, if you're a worker, a student considering making a change, is this what the job market's going to look like by the time I finish my program in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years? When the economy comes back, how different are the jobs going to be compared to today? In the last 2 recessions, we've seen the long-term structural change, economic changes taking place in the labor market, moving from a goods-based manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy broadly. We've seen those changes accelerate, but it's not necessarily clear that that will happen in this recession and recovery. So lots of questions there. The second part of our analysis focused on why workers were looking to make a change. What were their motivations? And so workers here were given 8 choices in a random order, and they were allowed to rank the top 3 most important motivations. And we rolled these choices up into 3 broad categories: financial or advancement motivations, control, and purpose or fit. So financial or advancement includes things like changing fields so you can earn more money, having more opportunities to advance or get promoted, or to have a more stable income. Control includes wanting to have more autonomy or control over your work or your schedule, as well as just looking for work that is less stressful. And then finally, purpose or fit includes wanting to do work that helps more people, work that's more interesting or engaging, as well as just work that's a better fit for your talents. And so I've seen people argue, often anecdotally or without evidence, that it's all just economics, or it's all about higher purposes, so to speak. But the reality is that workers' motivations include both and are complex. So we've looked at this data a couple of different ways. One is, if you had to pick the most important motivation, certainly the financial and advancement motivations would win out. So we found that half of workers roughly wanted to make a change because they wanted to earn more or advance. And that's followed by 30% of workers who said it was something, a purpose or fit kind of motivations, and 18% who said that having more control was their most important reason for wanting to make a change. We then broke these out by the 8 individual most important reasons workers selected for wanting to make a change. And I'd highlight a couple of takeaways here. One, it is true among the reasons provided that just wanting to earn more money stands out, with 34% of workers saying that was their most important reason, which is higher than any of the other 7 reasons. But the second takeaway is that it's only 34%, meaning that 2 out of 3 workers said that it was something besides just wanting to make more money was their chief motivator. The second most common answer was actually doing work that helps more people, which falls into that purpose fit category. But it's actually surprising to me that after earn more money, it's just surprising how rich and diverse the mix of motivations are for workers who are looking to make a change. And what's not captured in these charts are workers' second and third most important reasons, which were sort of complicated to display, but let me just add 2 insights that came out of that data. One is that money is usually part of the decision calculus. So nearly 70% of workers had wanting to earn more money in their top 3 reasons for wanting to make a change. And then the other factor that stood out was wanting to reduce stress from work, which was actually nearly 40% of workers had that in their top 3. So even though it's, rarely the most important reason, it's usually part of that decision calculus. The final topic that we analyzed was, given this broad interest in changing fields and reskilling, do Americans have access to the education and training that they want? And so we found that less than half of Americans say that they've got access to the education and training they want, with only 13% strongly agreeing with that statement. Adults with less than a BA were actually substantially less likely, about 20 percentage points less likely to say that they had access to the education and training we want. Another sort of similar a question along the same theme is we asked them, would getting more education and training be worth the cost to you? And similarly, less than half said that they believed in post-secondary education's value proposition. And what's especially striking here along the same theme is that people who already have a BA or higher are actually the most likely to think that getting more education would be worth it on the margin. So the answer to the question I posed, at least in the broad sense, is when it comes to education and training, that most Americans aren't getting what they want. And then finally, we've been asking a series of questions about what Americans do want that longtime followers may have seen in previous weeks, specifically about their education preferences. And the first thing I'd say on this question is we've seen a strong and I'd say consistent preference for non-degree programs like certificates and certifications, as well as skills training that isn't attached to any credential, a preference for those kinds of alternatives over degree programs. And that preference for non-degree programs and skills training is even stronger for people with a high school education or less, with 71% of those we surveyed saying they'd prefer it over a degree program. And then finally, it's interesting to note that Americans also say that they value online education and training over the alternatives, meaning the way we ask the question is, if they were to spend their own money on education and training, they say they'd rather spend it on an online program than something that's in-person or work-based. And I think, that just really raises a lot of sort of interesting questions about the future of online learning, online post-secondary education, let's say, which, hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss in the panel. In the end, I'd say, many of these findings and the questions that I'd raise just speak to the need to continue to build a consumer-centered learning ecosystem that better serves the millions of Americans who are looking to reskill and retool and get back on their feet and get back to work in the next few years as we move through the recession and recovery. That includes, from our perspective, helping people navigate learning and work to understand the talents that they have and how they connect to new opportunities, helping them build on those talents and skills by accessing learning that is relevant and value, while getting the supports that they need to persist to and through higher education. And then finally, helping them get hired in that good first job in the field that they're looking to enter. So I encourage you to go to our Public Viewpoint webpage if you want to access this deck and more materials. And we also have a really, really great web tool that allows you to play around with these data yourself and see our results from previous weeks. So with that, thank you. And Jenna, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, wonderful. Well, thanks, Andrew. I know just from looking at the chat and some of the Q&A already, there's lots of questions here, so we'll get into it pretty quickly. I'm going to start out with just a question for each of our panelists, and then we'll get into some discussion across the group and bring Andrew back into that too. But Karan, let's start with you. So, we know that people will need some form of reskilling to switch career fields, but Opportunity at Work has also demonstrated that many workers have existing skills that can translate into new roles. And it's a matter of recognizing those, both from the employer side, but also from the individual worker side as well. Can you just share a little bit about some of the research you've been doing and where you see that fitting into the discussion we're having today?
Yep. Thanks, Jenna. Thanks, Andrew and Strada for really keeping the individual at the center and developing insights and hearing their voice in this. So Opportunity at Work is focused on enabling individuals who we call stars. They're skilled through alternate routes, work, learn, and earn to their full potential. And specifically, Jenna, to your question, we put out a piece of research earlier this year that said there are 71 million stars. So 71 million working adults today in the labor market who have the skills to be doing higher wage work if those jobs were available and made accessible to them. What do I mean by this? I think it's important to have a market that actually, where individuals and, to your point, employers can understand the skills that people are already bringing to work. So if you are today in a customer service role, a frontline customer service role, or you were in a customer service role and have lost your job, in that role, you have empathy, you have communication, you have problem solving, you have teamwork, you have collaboration. A lot of those skills are the same kinds of skills you would need in a sales rep job, which typically across geographies pays much more than a frontline customer service job. If you're in a sales rep job, a lot of the skills that you demonstrate in those jobs are what you need in a real estate agent job, which pays more than a sales rep job. Yet when we think about how hiring happens and how transitions happen in the labor market, they very rarely are done at these fundamental skills and capabilities level. So when we think about hiring a real estate agent, we're looking for someone who has been a real estate agent for the last 4 years to hire into that job, versus how can we think about what transitions for true mobility look like, and what are these pathways that are really skills and capabilities based. And then on the other end, how can individuals better understand, in the work that I'm doing, in the work that I'm demonstrating today, these are my skills and these are how they can be transferable to other roles that may be open now, that may be paying more in the area that I'm in. So having really a market that functions more on a skills and capabilities level, and how that is understood and valued, is important to be able to make these transitions, either before education or after you've had education as well.
Great, we're gonna come back to that in a minute. Brent, so it appears here in the data that we've got a challenge. Less than half of Americans are saying they have access to the education and training that they want. You've been grappling with this issue of capacity, and do our workforce and education systems have the capacity for a crisis of this unprecedented nature? So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what you're finding in some of your own research. What are some of the policy options for increasing capacity and really empowering people to make choices in the training that they pursue?
Well, thank you so much, Jenna and Strada, for convening this conversation. I think it's vital, and I think that the interest that's being shown is just an indicator of just how much some of these themes are on people's minds. I think we have a couple different kinds of capacity issues now. To some degree, a lot of the work that many of us have been doing over the last few years to think about skills and helping people move along and advance in their careers is now in suspended animation, because the real challenge is just jobs, or it will be as states reopen and economies try to get back on their feet. And I think there are very serious capacity issues. We saw this with we saw it on the front end with the unemployment system. A system that was completely overwhelmed, and is still, I think, substantially overwhelmed by the demand for services and for people trying to register for unemployment. And to my mind, I think we're looking at that same problem expressed differently as the economy reopens. Many people, because of programs like Paycheck Protection and the stimulus and so on, are going to be able to go back to the jobs that they worked in before, but many are not. And so we have to really ask ourselves a serious question. Does the public workforce system have the capacity? Does the training system have the capacity to meet the immediate needs that workers are going to be facing? Get back into those workers that can't go back to their old jobs, get back into the workforce. And so what we've been asking ourselves is, what are the kinds of flexibilities that we need to build into our training system, our resourcing of training that'll make it as easy as possible for people to get back to work. Now, one of the assets we have moving into this is that many of the people who will be looking for work actually have extensive work histories, right? These are people who were involuntarily separated. They had many years of experience. They had careers that have been interrupted, and they are going to take off like a shot, trying to find work in whatever work they can that sort of works with their skills, and we need to be supportive of that. This isn't a time to try to retrain a bunch of people who don't want or need retraining. So triaging the population is going to be extremely important, I think, and making sure that we provide resources to those workers that can quickly and easily reattach to the workforce in a way that they can be easily used. And one of the concepts that we'd like to see, that I'd like to see, is exploration of personal reemployment accounts, that people would have a chunk of resources that they could use for, if they needed it, job training, but also for transportation, childcare, and other services that they're going to need to get restarted in their jobs. So for that population, I mean, we're fortunate in that way. This is a well-prepared, highly motivated group of workers. We also need to be thinking about who's best to administer this. I've got concerns that no matter how much money we put into the public workforce system, we can never build the kind of capacity that we need to deal with this population, and that it might be better to kind of layer this so that we have resources flowing into the WIOA system, but then we also have another tranche of resources that's really available for governors to direct into restarting regional economies. And that money could be used to fund either training or to fund the personal reemployment accounts. And so that we want flexibility, as much flexibility as we can get in the entire system, all the way down to the workers. And then again, in this triaging concept that I talked about, really reserving the capacity of the WIOA system to provide the kind of support that workers with more barriers need in order to get back to work. So trying to make sure that we get everybody who can get back to work on their own, back working, and we're preserving that system and those resources, the case management and other services for those populations that need more assistance, rather than trying to funnel everybody through the public workforce system. So those are kind of some of the concepts that we're playing with. I think in addition to that, we probably do not have enough capacity just in terms of training per se. And we think that the governor's reserve funds that I just talked about could, another fruitful use of those would be to help community colleges and others, training providers, to build out their capacity.
Great, thanks, Brent. And I know you're going to be publishing a paper on some of these recommendations pretty
Yes, that's right, in the next 2 weeks.
Great, so we'll be keeping an eye out for that. Carol, so Strata's spent the last 5-6 years now at this point working to surface the perspectives of Americans on the value of their education experiences. In this particular survey, which is with 11,000 Americans, you've also talked in your survey with Gallup to almost 400,000 Americans. But in this particular survey, as we look at the impact and how Americans are reporting the impact, can you offer up some initial implications so far? What are you learning, and what do you see are some of the implications, particularly for policymakers and philanthropists?
Well, thank you, Jenna, and fellow panelists, and for everybody who's joining today. As sort of the executive sponsor of this work at Strata, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening and to how you have responded to this body of work that really listens to Americans. We've been gratified by that, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you as we continue to keep our pulse on what the education consumer really wants and needs in this environment, but also going forward. As Jenna says, we've talked to, over the since 2016 actually, over 350,000 Americans, broken down by every demographic group you can imagine, and also by states, by individual localities. We know a lot about the education consumer. Those who went to post-secondary education, who are in it, those who aspire to it. And we really believe that when you listen to those consumers, it will guide what the future looks like. What we've learned, Jenna, and others from this COVID survey we've been doing, is that every aspect of the nation's workforce and post-secondary system is now being called into question as really if it's adequate, as we've been talking about, whether we do have the system in the United States to really address the massive challenge we have in front of us. And when you think about how we organize education and training in the States and in this country, the vulnerabilities of that system have been highlighted through COVID. The way people navigate the system, the way that they are assessed, their knowledge is assessed, whether they know stuff, how they're given credit for that knowledge, how they are able to get what they need in a timely manner and affordable and relevant. So every aspect of our system has been questioned by listening to consumers these last 4 years, and in particular since COVID. We need to think about much better ways to advise people. Right now, the best source of advice, according to consumers, comes from their place of employment. Well, some of them are not employed. A lot of people don't have access to the wisdom that comes through working and getting to know what you're good at, what you're not good at. How do we replace that kind of advice? How do we help people navigate what to do if they want to change their career? What are their skills, their attributes, their interests? And where do they go to assess that? And especially if you're from a disenfranchised population. How do you get the kind of training you need and not have to bite off an entire degree program that may be very risky, very expensive for you, and not provide you the relevance that you see immediately? So every aspect has been questioned. And I think that we've got a lot of clues on what a new system would look like when you listen to the consumer. It's, do we have the wherewithal to really challenge our current system that we have so much invested in? And how do we pivot it?
Great. Well, let's come back to one of the data points here. So we see that Americans with the lowest levels of education, a high school diploma or lower, are the least likely to say they have access to the kind of training they want. So I'm curious, Carol, Karen, Brent, how should education providers and training providers of all kinds, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, do a better job of reaching those individuals? And then on the employer side, what needs to change on the hiring, in the way that we hire? And as we think about transferability of these, of individuals' existing skills, particularly those that may not have a BA and may be locked out of existing jobs. So maybe let's start on the provider side and then get to the employer side. Who wants to jump in there first? Brent, you want to go ahead?
So one of the things that I found interesting in the survey is sort of the pervasive, what appeared to me anyway, and Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it looks like a pervasive kind of skepticism about the BA and a preference for these sort of shorter term credentials. And there's a significant part of me that thinks that we've really overdone that in terms of messaging to the community. As Karin was talking about at the beginning, these kind of flexible skills are the ones that are most in demand in the economy. The ability to communicate, work in teams, all of the non-cognitive soft skills, these kinds of intangibles are what employers consistently point to as saying what's most in need in their operations. And yet we keep flooding the system, I think, with a message that says, you don't need a 4-year degree. What you need is a kind of a narrow technical certification. And I think that there's a disconnect there between what employers are asking for and what the system and frankly our public debate over this is privileging. I don't agree actually that that people should undersell a BA. I think that it is in fact one of the best investments that people can make. And it's reflected in the data. I think that communities with lots of people with bachelor's degrees tend to do better as communities when that level of education is widely adopted within a community. So I think that that's something we need to explore. And I would just close that out by saying, in another survey that we've done, we'll be releasing here shortly, what we find is that people who do get those narrower technical degrees, whether they're at the BA level or at the associate's level, they tend to burn out rather quickly in their career choices, relatively speaking. And I noticed in Andrew's presentation, you have this sort of IT superhighway going on, where you've got a whole bunch of people leaving or saying they would like to leave, and a whole bunch of people saying they want to get in. And I think that that's an indication that we have sold everyone on the notion that those types of degrees are their best bet. And then when they get the jobs, it's like, I have some buyer's remorse out of this. And I think I would actually be better off somewhere else. And when you look at the three reasons that people are saying they're leaving, it's fit and purpose is one of the top three reasons. I think that we have pushed people too much into too narrow a pipeline.
I don't know if we lost Andrew or not. There he is. Andrew, you might want to bring in some of the work we've done on the asking about the value of the degrees and what we've learned, and Nicole from our team is on as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Spot on with that observation.
And I think that so number one, in the analysis we presented, all degree programs are combined, and so there wasn't necessarily a particular aversion to the bachelor's degree versus the graduate degree versus the associate's degree, but really just a perception of a general demand for something besides the degree programs for some of the reasons that Carol likely mentioned. And I think it's also tied to this notion that, the longer term degree programs probably work pretty well. We have access to those at the front end of our lives, but these people who are looking to make a transition mid-career where they've accumulated education, work experience, so on and so forth, they're not looking to leave the workforce for as long as is necessary to pursue a long-term program like that. Just to speak broadly to what we found, one of the things we've been doing at the Center for Consumer Insights at Strada is looking at this notion of consumer value or subjective value, asking people, was it worth the cost? Did it make you an attractive job candidate? And so we've come out with those results late last year. But the big finding, when you look at this across different kinds of educational attainment levels, comparing certificates and certifications to AAs, BAs, graduate degrees, and so forth, and looking at kinds of programs, right? Because I think the concept of a BA is that it has nothing to do with the career. In fact, about 80% of them are things like STEM, business, healthcare, occupational preparation. And so what we find, though, consistently is even in cases where the earnings aren't necessarily that high, like education programs or social work and the like, is that those programs that are relevant and career oriented receive the highest value ratings from alumni. And so that's something that I think drives a lot of our thinking as well, is just how important it is. Not necessarily, I mean, the length can be flexible, right, in terms of what's required how much preparation is required to get into the career you want. But as long as there's relevance, as long as it's tied to connected to work-based learning, allows you to get a good job. Those are the things that are important, more so than the length of the program.
I'll jump in and say I don't think this is an either or, and I say that to the sense of there are you know, 70 plus, half the workers today, 60% of workers today do not have a BA. And a significant number of them are not going to go back to get a BA. So we need to have a labor market that can work, right? For the 60% of workers who don't have the BA today are not going to go back to have to go get a BA, or a number of them are not going to go back to get their BA, and for whom really the real wages have declined over the last 40 years, not stayed the same, have declined, right, over the last 40 years. So that market is broken for 60% of people who are in that market, disproportionately people of color, right? Like, I mean, those without a degree who are workers right now. So when you put a degree requirement on your job description, you are screening out 70% of Black people. You're screening out 75% of Latinx folks. You're screening out 60+% of rural workers. Like, that's what you do when you put a degree requirement on a job description today. And so the question to me is, right, like, there are multiple pathways that should be able to lead to economic mobility, and those pathways without a BA, those alternate routes, are not driving. They're not valued and accepted in the job market today. I mean, the other point that if this recovery follows the pattern of the last recovery, that is going to get worse. So between 2008 and 2019, almost 3/4 of the new jobs that were created required a 4-year degree. And so we had basically 60% of workers could only apply to a quarter of the jobs that were created. Not even could only apply. They'd be screened out, right? 3/4 of workers would be screened out of the 3/4 of the jobs that were created. And so, and that starts with, there are things around credential inflation, there are things around automation and the changing nature of work. There are things around, on the employer side, not just removing the degree requirements, but thinking hard about skills and competencies you need, but also about job design, right? Like, if this is a middle wage job, what is the entry level equivalent of that middle wage job that can actually be a pathway? Because we are seeing a hollowing out of middle wage jobs into low wage and high wage work. And so what are the pathways that lead to better work from entry level to mid level? I mean, you have job descriptions that don't require a degree requirement today, saying for an entry level job, you need 2 years of work experience. Well, if you need 2 years of work experience, how is that an entry level job? So we need to start thinking about what these pathways look like for mobility, especially for the new to world jobs that are getting created now. The jobs that exist today are not the ones that are going to exist next year, the year after that. So as new jobs come to life, we need pathways into work on the labor market side.
So if
Jenna, I was going to say, Jenna, you asked about employers, so I don't want to lose that thought. One of the things we did, I think a couple of years ago, was a survey of employers, asking this question about the college credential as the criterion for getting a lot of these jobs. And it turns out that when we asked employers, these are hiring managers, we asked, not HR people necessarily, but hiring managers, are you open to considering some other criteria to assess whether a candidate is appropriate for your job? The vast majority of these managers were open to it. Like, yeah, I'm open to it. Conceptually, yes. But when we asked the question, if you didn't have the college credential as the screen, how confident are you that your company would be able to assess the skills of applicants without that credential? Then it fell down a lot. They have low confidence that they have the tools necessary to assess people's skills if they don't use the credential as a proxy for qualifications. And I think that's one thing that we need to address in our workforce system in the US today are these skills assessments that are affordable, transparent, available, and speak across education and employment.
Yeah, I just want to make real clear that I'm not suggesting that everybody needs a BA, and I place a great value on vocational education and technical education, and those are extremely useful, necessary My comments really were going to that I think we've oversold the critique of the BA relative to what employers are actually telling us that they want and they need. You know, you ask them what are the top 10 things, and 8 of them have nothing to do with any kind of technical skill. They relate to other aspects of what it means to be able to work with other people. And in a service-dominated economy, that's understandable. You know, that this is what's required. So I don't mean to denigrate that in any way. I obviously, with 60% of the country not going to college, we need other ways of integrating people into the workforce, and credentials and associate's degrees. I would just again go back to the survey data we've been working on, which is if you're concerned about minority workers and their access to jobs, and not just jobs, but careers, we need to be really careful about telling people that all they need is an associate's degree. Because in our survey of the STEM workforce, those people with associate's degrees were the first out, in large part because of skills decay, of the atrophy of skills. You know, you get the credential, but then the technology changes, and a lack of a pathway once you get into the business. So I think we've undersold the kind of skills that we develop through a BA, and maybe there are other ways of doing it rather than, you know, sending everybody off to a 4-year college or university. But we undersell those, and we consistently oversell the acquisition of narrow technical skills.
Well, that's actually a great segue. Maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. We have a question from the audience from Ralph Wolf of QA Commons. Thanks for joining us, Ralph. You know, Ralph's question is exactly the point you're making. You know, he said, our experience is that technical skills alone aren't enough for the changing market. Soft skills are critical for adapting, communicating. You know, where might those skills fit into short-term certificate and degree programs? But I think as we're talking about this point of knowing that the BA is not necessarily the only pathway and the only option for people today, how do we ensure that they are getting the skills that enable people to build careers? And maybe Carol, you want to take that first?
I do, because I think that our research would suggest that the best place people learn those is on the job. And so we separate in US a great deal, education and training, then a job. And I think it's the integration that's going to provide the full experience to people. And you learn teamwork by doing it. You learn problem solving by doing it. And so we really need to get to how do we truly provide job-driven education and training, which does allow people to integrate employment and education, because you can't separate them, because that's where you learn best some of these skills.
Carmen, do you want to jump in there? There's also another question here for you that I think piggybacks on this, was asking, you know, how do we illustrate those pathways for job seekers and trainers, especially that are changers who don't have the BA, right? And Brett, to your point, who get to a certain point and then get stuck. What can we be doing to help address that without having to necessarily redirect and go back toward the BA?
Yeah, I'll say there are things on 2 dimensions to that, and I just want to plus one Carol's point on not separating kind of education from work, and how are these things sort of interconnected over the life of an individual, also not just on the front end. On the how do we illustrate the pathways, I think there are 2 aspects to it. One is the data itself, which we need better data around those things, and the second is how do people make decisions, or how can that data information be presented in an actionable way, in a way in which sort of individuals make decisions and are aware of those things. So on the data itself, there's been progress, but we still don't have good and granular enough understandings of what different pathways look like for economic mobility. So if I start in low wage work, what are the pathways that have been taken to middle wage work and higher wage work, and how have those been different than they were 10 years ago and 20 years ago? And it can't just be at the ONET level, it has to go down to the job title level. So there is ONET data, yes, but oftentimes, even when we look at the categories that are here or the descriptors of the ONET level, they are one level up from the specific job title level that employers are hiring on today. And a lot of that information sits within employers, but not in an aggregated real-time way across. So there's a data piece itself, and there's work happening on how that happens better. The second is understanding how people make decisions. I can only think about getting a job that I know A, is a job that exists. B, I know that that is a job, I feel like that is a job I could do. Third is I heard about it from somebody I trust or from some source of information that I trust. So I also worry sometimes that there's work happening on the data side that's very technical, scraping labor market data, all of that. But like how consumable is that information for someone? Most people, if you ask them, what job do you think you could do? It'll be jobs that they've heard of from their neighbor, from their family, that they've seen, right? People around them or people in their neighborhood do those jobs. And the identity of you can do something else that you can be great at. Well, A, I need to know that that something else exists. B, I need to have some role model or some way of knowing that that could be me, right? And then third, I need some actionable information about how do I get to that? What do I need to do to get to that? And sometimes this work lives in silos, right? Like we expect career coaches and family and so on to do this, and then we expect, right, like state data systems and others to do this, and that needs to connect for it to actually be valuable.
So to pick up on what Carol said and then what Karen just finished with, I agree completely that the right way to do education and training is to seek integration of these types of skill sets. And I think that's been validated in the data. You just have much better outcomes in terms of wages, retention, advancement when technical skill programs are integrated with these professional skills, soft skills, whatever your preferred term is for that. And I think that's absolutely the right way to go. And so on Karen's point about like bridging this information gap, this is also something we're going to be addressing in the paper on sort of how we respond to COVID, which is there's tremendous work being done out there in the labor market information world, EMSI, other organizations, which Strata, of course, is associated with, but some really remarkable tools that are being developed that are much more real-time in terms of providing people about information about jobs that are available, but also getting down into the skills that are required, and then also helping workers understand their own skill portfolio relative to the current demand in the economy and figuring out how to bridge, how to get that flexible credential that's the thing that is standing between you and being fully qualified for the job that's available. And so what we want to see happening here is that governors really be incentivized and we provide resources to them to acquire some of these next generation labor market information tools, which I think are just dramatically better than what we currently deal with and are really necessary in this environment where there's so much change, not relative to the restart, which companies and industries still exist and which don't, and what there's jobs, and that is going to be vital for helping people transition back into the workforce.
Yeah, and Karen, I mean, you guys have built this marketplace that's still early and you're testing it out, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because I think that's a practical example of what Brent's talking about.
Yeah, I agree with Brent, and thanks, Jenna. So at Opportunity at Work, we have a marketplace that is live in DC and in California and soon to be rolled out in other places, which is essentially for employers to have an easy way to think about how do I get a pool of talent that are stars, that if I want to waive the bachelor's degree requirement, how can I see a pool of talent for those jobs that they do not have the BA requirement, but they do have skills and capabilities. And importantly, to also see education and training providers for whom a subset of who they are training, there are these alternate routes. There are these, more alternate pathways that many who do not have a bachelor's degree in particular favor as sort of the reskilling and skilling pathway. And to see, okay, if these employers in my area for these roles are hiring from a Europe of this world, a Perscolas of this world, a Merit America of this world, or many, many other providers that exist that are serving really, low wage workers today to help them transition into other roles, I should be doing that too. And then to be able to look at profiles of individuals on a skills and capabilities basis. So that's one. There are many others. And so I think the call to action for me is actually on the employer side, which is do the hard work of thinking about what you really need in the job descriptions, and then do the work of thinking about where are the pools of talent that maybe are not the more traditional pools of talent that you've been screening out, and then try that, right? And hold yourself to real metrics and accountability of how you're going to do talent management in a way that, yes, provides more opportunity, but frankly, we've seen will also deliver better business value for it. And I think that is important as we think about coming out of this recovery. What kind of recovery do we want to have? And do we want to sort of fall back to the kind of, what I would call suboptimal behavior, right, that we've had, versus a new way of thinking about this that can also, and we've seen this, deliver actual business value, right, to companies. And I should say, in DC and California, if we're hiring, it's starstalent.org is the marketplace.
Great. Well, I think we have time for just about one more question. I'm going to pivot topics just so that we can get to a range of questions here. One of the questions, which probably Andrew, you can jump in here, but I would be curious for everyone else to kind of share your own perspective, is, do you have any idea why learners seem to prefer online work to work-based?
Could be, I don't know is the short answer, but it could be the current moment we're in, an aversion to doing any sort of thing in person. But we're also, remember the population we're asking, adults 18 and older. That's a pretty big population of people. And I think we have seen, even before COVID, a change, a wanting flexible options in order to fit them into my schedule, my family responsibilities, so on and so forth. There's a possibility that may have been accelerated with this pandemic. That would be my instinct, but it's something that we have yet to unpack.
Anyone else want to weigh in there?
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. I do think there's a social factor to people perhaps in this environment not wanting to have to leave their homes if they don't have to get credentials. Like it's safer. It could be sort of psychologically safer as well. It can be intimidating to walk into a classroom or even a business to do on-the-job training, and this is a way to kind of ease in.
And possibly, as Andrew was saying, we do know from our previous research, the number one barrier to continuing your education is not necessarily money. It doesn't fit my lifestyle. It gets in the way of work and it gets in the way of family. Just like everybody else has learned to do their work via technology. We've gotten comfortable with the Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars, and we don't have to all go to New Orleans and meet, and we can do it via Zoom. People are getting much more comfortable with the technology and realizing that it can be an enhancement and accommodate your life, but as face-to-face is more difficult. So I think we'll do a lot more exploration of this. It's fair to say, Andrew, with our team. It's one area that keeps coming up.
Yeah, wonderful. Well,
nothing against New Orleans, by the way. If I've got New Orleans people on the phone. If Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid is on, I know I'm going to hear from her. What do you got against New Orleans? I love New Orleans. It's not bad.
Well, I think in another month from now, we're all going to be dying to be together in a conference, but I think you're totally right. Well, thank you all. We're at 3 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We never get to all of the questions. I wish we could. There's actually been some great discussion in the chat going on too amongst panelists, so that's great. We hope you can continue that conversation. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another webinar, so you'll hear more from us on the topic and the focus. But thank you all for joining us. Andrew, thanks for taking the time to walk through the new data. Karin, Carol, Brent, thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise, and have a wonderful and safe afternoon.